Hey everyone, ready to dive into like a whole galaxy of opinions about Star Wars?
Sounds exciting.
We're going to be taking a close look at The Acolyte, the new show on Disney Plus.
This one has caused quite a stir.
It has.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't believe the amount of stuff I've got here. YouTube videos, transcripts, all sorts of things.
Reviews too, I bet.
Oh, tons of those, both positive and
very much not positive.
yeah, let's just say some people have some very strong feelings about this show.
It definitely seems to have touched a nerve.
Exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're here to help you kind of sift through all these different opinions, figure out what are the main points of
The main controversies.
yeah, what's got everyone talking.
So, where do we even begin with a show like this?
Well, I guess we could start with the basics, right? Like, what is The Acolyte actually about?
Right.
So it takes us back in time, way back, like about a century before The Phantom Menace, and it's a kind of mystery thriller. Yeah. And it focuses on this former Padawan who's investigating all these murders.
Murders, huh? That's a new one for Star Wars, at least in live action.
Right. And it's not just set in any random time. It's during the High Republic era.
Which, up until now, we haven't really seen in a live action show.
Yeah, exactly. And this era is supposed to be like a golden age for the Jedi, right?
Yeah.
All peaceful and prosperous.
So, it makes you wonder, how does it all go so wrong? How do we get from this golden age to the,
To the rise of the Sith and everything. That's definitely part of the mystery this show is trying to unravel.
So who's the mastermind behind all this?
Well, that would be Leslye Headland. She's the creator and showrunner.
Okay, I know that name. She did, what was it? Russian Doll, right?
Yeah, and Sleeping with Other People.
Those are pretty different from Star Wars, more like, dark comedy and...
Relationship stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So how is that sensibility going to translate to a galaxy far, far away?
Well, from what I've read, Headland's interested in flipping the script. Like, she wants to explore the dark side from the villain's point of view.
Wow, that's definitely a different take on Star Wars.
Yeah, and it's got people talking. Some are calling it a breath of fresh air for the franchise, while others are like, hold on, are you trying to make the Jedi the bad guys?
I mean, think about it. If the Jedi, who are supposed to be the heroes, are portrayed as flawed, even complicit in the rise of the dark side...
It makes you question everything, right? Like, what does that say about the nature of power? The dangers of blind faith?
Big questions, for sure.
And then there's the fact that Headland has said that the show is partly inspired by her own experiences. So you've got this personal narrative kind of woven into this whole genre-bending take on Star Wars.
No wonder people are having such strong reactions.
Exactly. And one of the biggest points of contention is how the Jedi are portrayed in this show.
Right.
Some sources are saying it's great that the show is challenging their, traditional image as heroes.
Showing that they're not perfect.
Yeah, but others are like, no, this is completely wrong. You're making them look incompetent, even villainous.
So where's the line there? Is it okay to critique the Jedi? Or is that, sacred ground for Star Wars fans?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
I mean, some sources are even arguing that the Jedi and the Acolyte are totally oblivious to the growing darkness, even though they're supposed to be, like, the guardians of peace.
It's like they're asleep at the wheel while the galaxy is heading for disaster.
Yeah, and there's one source that specifically mentions how the Jedi failed to prevent some key events in the show. Like, they have all this power, all this knowledge, and yet they still make these bad calls that lead to some pretty bad outcomes.
Which, raises the question, is this deliberate? Is Headland critiquing the Jedi Order itself, or is it just, sloppy writing, like some critics are saying?
Yeah, it's tough to say for sure, but it definitely adds another layer to the whole debate.
For sure. And then there's the central mystery of the show. Who is the Smo Ren character?
Oh, yeah. The masked villain. Everyone's got a theory about who they are.
The sources are full of fan theories, connecting them to all sorts of existing lore.
Right. And the show does reveal who Smo Ren is, but even that's divided the fandom. Some loved the twist, some felt let down.
So you have this tension between, like, subverting expectations and potentially disappointing the audience.
Exactly. It's like the show is a Rorschach test for Star Wars fans. Whatever you see in it, it says a lot about what you want from the franchise.
I like that analogy. But what about the more technical aspects of the show? The storytelling, the writing, all that.
Oh, some sources are not holding back on that front.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of complaints about the dialogue feeling stiff and unnatural. Also, some of the characters, their motivations are either inconsistent or just not explained well.
So it feels like we're being told what to think instead of the story showing us.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the budget. Apparently, this show had a massive budget.
I heard that.
But a lot of sources are complaining that you don't really see it on screen. Like, the visuals are just not that impressive for a show with that much money behind it.
Okay, so that's interesting. There seems to be this disconnect between the resources and the final product.
There is. And some sources are pointing to Leslye Headland's approach to production. It seems that she believes that the idea of one person managing a production is misogynistic.
Okay, I've heard her talk about that in interviews.
Right, and this is kind of a theme in her work. She sees the world through a very specific lens, and some sources argue that this perspective might actually be impacting the quality of the show.
Like impacting the plot, the pacing, the overall consistency.
Exactly. There's this source that brings up a specific example. It's this scene where a character does something that just doesn't make sense. And then later, Headland actually admitted that she didn't know what the character's motivation was supposed to be in that scene.
Oh, wow. That's kind of telling.
Right. It kind of supports the idea that maybe a lack of clear direction from the top is leading to these inconsistencies.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. So what else have you got in that stack of yours?
Well, we haven't even touched on representation, and there's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, The Acolyte has a very diverse cast, puts a lot of female characters at the forefront, but there are so many different opinions on whether that's a good or bad thing.
It's crazy, the range of reactions. Some sources are like, this is fantastic. We need more of this in Star Wars. And then you've got others saying, feels forced, like it's distracting from the story.
Okay, so it's a pretty sensitive topic.
Yeah, and then it gets even more heated because some people are accusing anyone who criticizes the show of being sexist or bigoted.
Oh, wow. So it's gotten caught up in the whole identity politics debate.
Totally. It makes it really hard to have a balanced conversation about the show's actual strengths and weaknesses.
It does, because, yeah, representation is important. It's great to see a show that reflects the diversity of the real world.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, it shouldn't be the only thing we judge a show on. The story, the characters, all of that has to work too.
Right. It has to be entertaining.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of things that have to work, what about the whole canon issue? Does the Acolyte fit into what we already know about the Star Wars universe?
That's a good question, and one that's causing a lot of debate.
Yeah, some sources are pointing out all these contradictions and inconsistencies with established lore.
Like, give me an example.
Well, there's this one character who, according to the timeline, shouldn't even exist in this era.
Really? That's a big one.
It is. And then there are criticisms about how the Force is portrayed, even the origins of certain characters. It's like the show is bending the rules of the universe to fit its own narrative.
Which can be frustrating for those who are really into the lore and continuity of Star Wars, you know?
Yeah, like the creators are saying, we're not interested in fitting into your carefully constructed world. We're going to do our own thing.
Right.
So you've got these two camps forming. Those who are excited about the new possibilities and those who feel like the show is trampling all over something they love.
Right, right. That's a really interesting dynamic. But amidst all this controversy, all this debate, it's important to remember that The Acolyte is still, at its core, trying to tell a story.
And that story has some pretty deep themes and messages woven into it.
Exactly. Like, it's not just about lightsabers and space battles. It's about good versus evil, the nature of power, moral choices, stuff that resonates with us even outside of Star Wars.
Absolutely. And Headland has talked about wanting to explore this idea of moral relativism to challenge that black and white morality that we often see in Star Wars.
So it's not about who wins or loses, but about understanding the motivations, the complexities of each side.
Yeah. And that's why people are talking about it. They're analyzing every scene, debating every choice. The show's making them think about the Star Wars universe and maybe even about themselves in a new way.
That's pretty impressive for a show that's just getting started.
It is. So let's dive into some of those specific criticisms and controversies, shall we?
Let's do it.
Okay. So one of the
most talked about things with this show is definitely how it portrays the dark side of the Force.
It's definitely different from what we usually see in Star Wars.
Yeah, normally the dark side is presented as, purely evil and something to fear. But in The Acolyte, it's more like just another aspect of the Force.
Like another tool you could use.
Exactly. It raises the question, is it inherently bad? Or is it just a matter of, how it's wielded?
Right, like a lightsaber. It can be used for good or evil.
And that makes the Sith, who are usually the bad guys, a lot more interesting in this show.
Because they're not just evil for the sake of being evil, right?
Right. We see glimpses of their past, their struggles, and it humanizes them in a way we haven't really seen before.
Yeah, it's not that simple black and white morality we're used to.
And that complexity is what makes the show so engaging. You're not just rooting for the good guys, you're trying to understand why everyone is making the choices they make.
It's like that saying, every villain is the hero of their own story.
Exactly. And speaking of choices, let's talk about the Jedi. The Acolyte is pretty critical of the Jedi Order, which is something we haven't seen much of in live action.
Yeah, they're definitely not the perfect, all-knowing heroes here.
We see them making mistakes, overlooking things, even failing to protect people.
And some sources argue that it's not just a few mistakes, it's like a systemic problem within the Order. They become complacent, arrogant, more worried about their power than actually helping people.
So, are they victims of their own success? They've had peace for so long that they've forgotten what real danger looks like?
Yeah, and that blindness to the real threat is a big part of what the show's exploring.
Makes you think, is power always corrupting? Can anyone, even the Jedi, stay truly good once they have that much power?
Big questions. And then there's that whole controversy about the
lightsaber headbutt.
Yeah, that scene. Some fans were absolutely furious about it.
I saw that online. People were losing their minds.
They were calling it ridiculous, disrespectful to the whole Star Wars universe.
Yeah, I mean, you've got fans who are super protective of the lore, the rules of Star Wars. For them, that scene was a step too far.
But the creators were just making stuff up, not taking it seriously.
But then you have others who see it as a stylistic choice, a way to emphasize the character's power, their defiance.
And they're willing to suspend their disbelief a bit to get a more impactful scene.
Which makes you wonder, how important is it to stick to the established canon? Is it okay to bend the rules a little if it serves the story?
Tough question. I guess it depends on what kind of fan you are.
That's true. And on that note, speaking of fans, we can't ignore the whole toxicity issue surrounding the show online.
It's really unfortunate, but not totally unexpected.
Yeah, Star Wars fans are passionate, which is great, but sometimes that passion turns into something ugly.
There's this source that talks about how the creators and the cast have been getting attacked, harassed online.
Just because some people don't like the show.
It's crazy. It's a reminder that fandom can be a double-edged sword.
Totally. It's great to love something, but you gotta remember there are real people behind these shows, these characters.
And words can hurt. So, moving on from that.
Okay, so where were we? Oh, right, we were talking about the mysteries and the characters. What about Smo Ren?
Yeah, he's the big bad, the puppet master behind everything, but we still don't know who he really is.
And the sources are full of speculation, trying to figure out his motives, his end game.
There's this one source that points out, no matter who Smo Ren turns out to be, he's a different kind of villain than we've seen before in Star Wars.
How so?
He's not like Darth Vader, this imposing force of nature. And he's not like Emperor Palpatine, this charismatic leader. He's more insidious, working from the shadows.
He's playing the long game, manipulating everyone without revealing himself.
Yeah, and that makes him even scarier in some ways.
Absolutely. It makes you constantly question, what is he really after? What's his plan?
And the show is doing a great job of keeping us in the dark.
Which, some people find frustrating. They want answers now.
But I kind of like the slow burn. It builds the tension, the mystery.
Yeah, it makes you pay attention to all the little details, trying to piece things together.
It's like a giant puzzle box.
And that's a good segue into another interesting aspect of the show. The deeper themes. What it's trying to say about the Star Wars universe and maybe even our own world.
Yeah, it's not just about the plot and the characters. There's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. One of the sources talks about this idea of the cyclical nature of history. Even though The Acolyte is set centuries before the Skywalker saga, it's showing us that the same patterns of conflict, of corruption, keep repeating themselves.
It's like that quote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
And the show is asking, is the galaxy doomed to repeat its mistakes? Is there a way to break the cycle?
It's a pretty heavy question, especially for a Star Wars show.
But it makes the show feel relevant, like it's talking about something bigger than just the events on screen.
It's like a reflection of our own world's struggles, even though it's set in the galaxy far, far away.
Exactly. And those struggles are especially evident in how the Jedi are portrayed. They're not just flawed, they're almost blind to the suffering around them.
Yeah, there's this source that says the Jedi and the Acolyte have lost touch with reality.
Yeah?
They're so concerned with their own power and influence that they've forgotten about the people they're supposed to protect.
So they're not just failing, they're almost part of the problem.
It's a very radical concept for Star Wars, right?
It is. And it's sparking a lot of debate. Is Headland trying to destroy the Jedi? Or is she just trying to make them more realistic, more human?
I guess it depends on how you interpret this show.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not giving us easy answers. It's forcing us to think, to debate, to question our own assumptions.
And that's not something you get from every Star Wars show.
Definitely not. So what else have you got in that pile of yours? Anything else about the characters, the themes, all that?
Well, we haven't talked about the actual storytelling, the way the show is structured. And that's another thing that's dividing viewers.
Really? How so?
Well, the show uses a lot of flashbacks, jumping back and forth in time. And some people are finding it confusing.
Oh, I can see how that could be jarring.
Right. They're used to a more straightforward linear narrative in Star Wars.
But then you have others who are loving the unconventional approach.
Yeah, they're saying it adds to the mystery, the suspense.
And it makes you pay closer attention, right? Trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together.
Exactly. And there's this one source that brings up a really interesting point. They say the flashbacks aren't just about revealing the past. They're also about exploring how we remember things, how we perceive time.
Whoa, that's deep.
Right. And they tie it back to the nature of the Force, which is often described as transcending time and space.
So the flashbacks aren't just memories. They're almost like glimpses into alternate realities.
Or maybe different timelines. It's a bit mind-bending.
It is, but it also adds this whole philosophical layer to the show.
Right. And speaking of philosophy, one theme that comes up a lot is this idea of balance.
Balance, huh? That's a big one in Star Wars.
Yeah, but the show seems to be challenging the traditional view of balance. Like, normally it's about the light side or the dark side, right? The Jedi fighting to maintain that balance.
And the Sith trying to disrupt it.
Right. But the Acolyte is suggesting that maybe it's not that simple.
So what are they saying? That there's another kind of balance?
Well, one source argues that true balance isn't about suppressing the dark side, but about understanding it, integrating it.
Interesting. So, like, not just fighting against it, but learning from it, accepting it as part of who you are.
Yeah, and they point to the Acolyte herself. She's drawn to the dark side, but she's also fighting against it.
She's not just a villain. She's someone who's trying to figure out her place in this, this messy, complicated world.
And that exploration of balance goes beyond just the Force. It's in the political systems, the power dynamics, even the personal relationships.
It's like the show is saying that nothing is ever purely good or purely evil.
Everything exists on a spectrum.
And finding that balance is the real challenge.
Exactly. Oh, and another thing everyone's talking about is the music.
The music. I haven't really focused on that.
Oh, you should. It's so different from what we're used to in Star Wars.
Really? How so?
Well, one source points out that the composer has really gone for a more experimental approach.
Experimental, huh?
Yeah, instead of those big orchestral themes, you get a lot of electronic sounds, unusual instruments. It creates a really unsettling atmosphere.
Like the music itself is part of the mystery, the darkness.
Exactly. Some people are even comparing it to the soundtracks of Stranger Things or Blade Runner.
Wow, that's pretty far from John Williams.
It is, but it works really well in the context of the show.
I'll have to pay closer attention to that next time I watch it. What else is going on? What else are people talking about?
Well, one thing that's gotten a lot of attention and some controversy is the show's inclusion of a same-sex kiss.
Oh, yeah. I saw that mentioned in a few of the sources.
It's a pretty bold move for Star Wars, and it's definitely generated a lot of different reactions.
I bet. So what are people saying?
Well, some are praising it for its representation, saying it's a step forward for the franchise.
Showing that love can exist in many forms, right?
Exactly. And it's treated as a normal, everyday thing, which is a powerful message in itself.
Especially considering how heteronormative Star Wars has been in the past.
Right, this is a big departure from that. But of course, not everyone's happy about it.
Yeah, some people always push back against change.
Some are saying it feels forced, like it's just there to check a box,
Like the creators are trying too hard to be woke.
Yeah, that's the criticism. But then others are pointing out that, love is love, and it's about time Star Wars reflected that.
It's a complex issue, and it definitely touches on a lot of sensitive topics.
It does, but it's also a sign that Star Wars is trying to evolve, to keep up with the times.
And that's probably a good thing, overall, even if it ruffles some feathers along the way.
Speaking of ruffling feathers, let's talk about those flashbacks again.
Okay, back to the past. What about them?
Well, one source makes the argument that they're absolutely crucial for understanding the story.
Because we get to see the Acolyte's backstory, right? Her past, her relationship with her master, and how she ended up leaving the Jedi Order.
Exactly. It's like we're putting together a puzzle, trying to figure out how her past experiences led her to where she is now.
And it adds to the mystery, right? Because we're getting hints about this larger conspiracy, but we don't have all the pieces yet.
Yeah, it keeps you guessing, keeps you on the edge of your seat.
And there's this other source that says the flashbacks aren't just about the past, they're about memory and perception.
Whoa.
Yeah, they're saying that the show's non-linear structure is kind of reflecting the nature of the Force itself.
Because the Force is supposed to transcend time and space, right?
Exactly. So these flashbacks aren't just memories, they're like glimpses into different realities, different possibilities.
Okay, now my head is spinning.
Mine too!
Yeah.
But it's a cool idea, right? It adds this whole other layer to the show.
It does. And speaking of layers, one of the big themes that keeps coming up is the idea of balance.
Balance, huh? We talked about that before.
We did, but it's worth revisiting because the Acolyte seems to be challenging the traditional Star Wars view of balance.
So not just light side versus dark side.
Right, like one source argues that true balance isn't about suppressing the dark side. It's about understanding it, integrating it.
Okay, so it's more nuanced than just good versus evil.
Exactly. And they point to the Acolyte again. She's drawn to the dark side, but she's also fighting against it.
It's like she's trying to find a way to reconcile those two opposing forces within herself.
And that struggle for balance is reflected in everything, from the political systems to the personal relationships.
It's a universal theme, right? We all struggle with finding balance in our lives.
Exactly. It's what makes the show so relatable.
So are we ready to move on to the next big controversy?
Let's do it. And the costumes of the Sith, which are, typically dark and imposing.
Yeah, very menacing.
It just shows you how much thought goes into every detail, even the clothes.
For sure. It's all part of creating that immersive world. Okay, there's one more thing we should talk about, and it's kind of, well...
Oh, the same-sex kiss.
Yeah, that scene.
Yeah, that one got people talking, for sure.
It did. Some praising the show for being inclusive, others saying it felt forced.
Yeah, it's a pretty big step for Star Wars, right? I mean, they've always been...
Very traditional.
Yeah, and for some fans, this is exactly what they've been wanting to see. Like, finally, some representation.
It shows that, love is love. It doesn't matter who you are.
And it's treated as totally normal, which I think is important.
It's not a big deal. It's just part of life.
But then, you've got the other side, the people who are saying it's like...
Too much, too soon.
Yeah, or that it's distracting from the story, taking away from the Star Wars magic or something.
It's understandable, though, right? I mean, change can be scary for some people.
It can, especially when it's something you're really passionate about.
Like Star Wars, it's been a part of people's lives for so long.
Exactly. But I think, ultimately, it's a good thing that the franchise is evolving, trying to be more inclusive.
Reflecting the world we live in now.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, back to the flashbacks for a minute.
Okay, yeah, those were interesting.
One of the sources was saying that they're really important for understanding the main character, the Acolyte.
Because we see her past, right? What led her to this point, why she left the Jedi Order.
Yeah, it's like we're slowly piecing together her story, her motivations.
And it also helps to build the mystery, because we get these glimpses of the bigger conspiracy, but we don't know the whole picture yet.
Right. It's like we're getting little clues along the way.
Exactly. It keeps you engaged, trying to figure out what's going on.
And there's this other source that takes it even further. They're saying that the flashbacks aren't just about revealing the past. They're also about...
memory and how we perceive time.
Yeah, and they connect it to the Force itself, which is supposed to be beyond time and space.
So it's like the flashbacks are almost glimpses into other dimensions, other possibilities.
Wow. It's getting pretty deep, huh?
It is. It's like the Acolyte is asking us to think about time and reality in a whole new way.
Which is something I never thought a Star Wars show would do.
Me neither. So what else have you got? Any more mind-blowing theories from your stack of sources?
Well, there's this one that talks about the concept of balance.
Balance. We've talked about that a few times already.
We have, but this source is looking at it from a slightly different angle. They're saying that the show is challenging the traditional Star Wars view of balance, the whole light side versus dark side thing.
Okay, so what are they saying? What's the new view of balance?
They're suggesting that true balance isn't about suppressing the dark side, but about understanding and integrating it.
So it's not about fighting the darkness, but about accepting it as part of yourself, part of the universe.
Yeah, like finding a way to live with both the light and the dark within you.
And that's reflected in the main character, right? The Acolyte. She's drawn to the dark side, but she's also struggling with it.
It's like she represents that internal conflict we all face, the struggle to find balance in our own lives.
And that makes the show really relatable, even if it's set in a galaxy far, far away.
Right. It's not just about spaceships and lightsabers. It's about something deeper, something human.
Speaking of human, what of the music? We haven't talked about the soundtrack yet.
Oh, the music is amazing. It's so different from what we're used to in Star Wars.
How so? What's different about it?
Well, one source said that the composer really experimented with the sound using a lot of electronic elements, unusual instruments.
Okay, so not your typical orchestral score.
Definitely not. It creates this really atmospheric, kind of unsettling feeling, like you're not sure what's going to happen next.
I can imagine that. It's like the music is adding to the suspense, the mystery.
Exactly. And some people have even compared it to the soundtracks of shows like Stranger Things or movies like Blade Runner.
Wow, that's pretty far from the classic John Williams sound.
It is, but it works so well in this show. It really adds to the whole mood and atmosphere.
I'll have to pay more attention to the music next time I watch it.
You should. It's definitely one of the things that makes the Acolyte so unique.
So it sounds like we've covered just about everything, from the controversial lightsaber headbutt to the more subtle themes of balance and morality.
And everything in between.
The Acolyte has definitely gotten people talking, and it's pushing the boundaries of what we expect from Star Wars.
It has. And I think one of the big takeaways is that there's still so much to explore in the Star Wars universe. There are new stories to tell, new perspectives to consider.
And new ways to challenge our assumptions about what Star Wars can be.
Exactly. And that's pretty exciting. I mean, who knows what kind of stories we'll get in the future.
Only time will tell.
Yeah.
But the Acolyte has definitely opened up some new possibilities.
It has.
Okay.
And it'll be interesting to see how it influences the franchise going forward.
For sure. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Acolyte. Hope you all enjoyed it.
And maybe it'll even spark some conversations of your own. What do you think about the show? What are your hopes and fears for the future of Star Wars?
Let us know.
Until next time, may the Force be with you.